There's a cartoon from World War II that never made it into most history books, but every soldier who saw it understood it immediately. Bill Malden, the cartoonist who drew the war as GIs actually lived it, showed his character Willie saying to an officer, "I'll let you know when we capture the inventor of the 88. It wasn't a joke about a weapon, it was a diagnosis of what the 88mm had done to the Allied Army's relationship with the battlefield. By 1944, the gun wasn't just a piece of German equipment. It was a recurring presence in nightmares, in after-action reports, and in the specific way Allied soldiers moved, dug, and died. To understand why Allied soldiers hated it the way they did, you need to understand something about how armies felt in 1940. The British Army went into France with tanks designed to be bulletproof, the Matilda II, a vehicle so heavily armored that Germany's standard 37mm anti-tank gun couldn't touch it. British tank crews understood they might take hits. They expected to absorb fire and push through. What they did not expect was to meet a weapon that could kill them from 1.5 miles away and punch through their armor like it wasn't there. The 88mm gun had started life as a Flak, an anti-aircraft weapon, developed in secret through the 1920s because the Versailles Treaty prohibited Germany from building modern artillery. It was the Flak version, towed and deployed in the field, that earned the gun its original reputation. The tank-mounted 88s, fitted to the Tiger I and later the Tiger II, came later. The feared one was the Flak 88, an anti-aircraft gun repurposed as a tank killer with such effect that it forced armies to reorganize around it. It appeared first in that role at the Battle of Arras in May 1940, when Matilda tanks crashed into the German 7th Panzer Division and the standard German anti-tank guns proved useless against their armor. The division commander, Erwin Rommel, gathered every gun he had, including his 88mm anti-aircraft pieces, and organized a firing line that stopped the British cold. The leading Matildas were knocked out. The lesson stayed with Rommel. The lesson stayed with the British too, though it took them longer to absorb it. The real education happened in North Africa. The desert stripped away the variables. No forests, no buildings, no terrain features to hide behind. Flat ground, long sight lines, and whatever weapons you brought. For the 88mm, that was perfect conditions. For the tanks that had to cross that ground, it was a laboratory in the specific geometry of dying at long range. At Halfaya Pass in June 1941, Rommel turned the lesson from Arras into Doctrine. He buried his 88mm guns in the sand, literally dug them into the earth so nothing was visible above the surface, and baited British tanks into the pass with what appeared to be a retreating German force. The British attacked with what they believed was a protected advance. The 4th Royal Tank Regiment's C Squadron drove directly into a wall of concealed 88mm fire. By mid-morning, C Squadron had been gutted, nearly every tank destroyed within hours of the attack opening. The 88s had torn them apart. The pass earned a new name that day, Hellfire Pass. Knocked out British tanks lay on the road and around the approaches. It was visible proof that a weapon existed that could kill a Matilda, the Queen of the Desert, before it ever got close enough to do anything about it. The numbers from North Africa became a recurring trauma. During operations like Battle Axe, a relatively small number of well-sighted 88s helped inflict tank losses out of all proportion to their numbers. 91 British tanks in that single operation. 2 Flak battalions with a combined strength of around 24 guns destroyed 264 British tanks by the end of 1941. The weapon had no equivalent on the Allied side. Britain's 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun was technically comparable in hitting power, but Doctrine forbade using it against ground targets. Allied tankers were left facing a weapon their own arsenals had no answer to, fired from distances they couldn't match, against vehicles they couldn't see. The 88mm wasn't famous because it appeared everywhere. It was famous because of what happened every single time it did. When U.S. forces arrived in North Africa in 1942, they carried fresh confidence in their M4 Sherman tanks and the expectation that experience would solve the problems the British had been struggling with. American military intelligence had published detailed reports on the 80s capabilities, including a 1942 tactical bulletin that specifically warned about the gun's dual anti-tank and anti-aircraft role and its use to destroy armor at ranges Allied commanders hadn't anticipated. The reports existed. They were read. At Faid Pass in Tunisia in early 1943, inexperienced American armored units rushed into a valley to attack what appeared to be a manageable German position anyway. Rommel had lined the approaches with concealed 88s alongside 75mm anti-tank guns. The Shermans were picked off at ranges well beyond what their own 75mm guns could reach. The 88mm armor-piercing shell could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor from nearly 2,000 yards. The Sherman's standard 75mm gun was largely outmatched frontally against the heaviest German armor, especially as engagement ranges opened up. The arithmetic of that exchange wasn't even close. The Americans had the lesson. They just hadn't paid the price for it yet. And until you pay the price, the lesson is just words on paper. American GIs developed a specific vocabulary for it. 88 fever was the term that spread through Allied tank units, a state of tactical anxiety that came from knowing any position, any advance, any moment of exposed movement might be terminated by a gun that operated at distances no Allied tank gun could match. An Australian infantryman fighting in North Africa called it the anti-everything weapon. That description wasn't hyperbole. It was an accurate functional summary of a gun that killed tanks, infantry, aircraft, fortifications, and the confidence of entire army units simultaneously. Infantry experienced the 88 differently than tankers, and in some ways worse. Against a tank, the 88 killed quickly. Against infantry, a single battery of 88mm guns could fire high-explosive shells that burst into a dense spray of fragments. Fast, flat, and brutally accurate in direct fire. The sheer velocity of the gun, well over 2,500 feet per second, meant it arrived before the sound of the shot. There was no whistle of warning, no overhead arc to give men a second to react. The shell hit and detonated before anyone knew it was coming. GIs who had dug foxholes against mortar fire learned that the same holes didn't necessarily protect against a direct fire weapon that could aim at the specific ground they were on. The foxhole was protection against artillery falling from above. It was a different problem entirely when the shell came in horizontally at that speed. Then there were the bomber crews, for whom the 88 was a completely different terror. German flak batteries defending industrial targets, railway junctions, and major cities were equipped with 88mm guns, coordinated with sophisticated fire control radar. The gun could reach bombers at an effective ceiling of around 26,000 feet, and higher in optimal conditions. Its shells were fused to detonate at the calculated height of the incoming formation, filling the sky with expanding clouds of hot metal fragments. A near miss didn't need to be a direct hit. An 88mm shell exploding within 200 yards of a B-17 could tear holes through aluminum skin, cut fuel lines, and send spinning shards through crewmen who had no way to fight back and no way to move. The bomb run, the straight, level, unvarying flight path required to aim bombs accurately, meant crews had to hold a predictable course long enough for German fire control to compute their position exactly when it mattered most. Flying through that killing zone without evasive maneuver, knowing every second was a calculation in someone else's fire control system, that was the job. Airmen coined their own terms for what it did to them. Flak happy entered the vocabulary of the 8th Air Force, a name for the psychological condition that developed in men who had flown too many missions through too many defended targets. Nightmares so vivid that men woke screaming. Constant flinching at unexpected sounds. The inability to function that followed from sitting in a thin aluminum fuselage, unable to shoot back, while the sky filled with black bursts that might be the last thing you saw. One account from a veteran of the 100th Bomb Group captured it plainly. The fear wasn't of fighters. Fighters could be outmaneuvered. The 88 had no opponent. Survival came down to mathematics and whatever luck a man had left. The German gun had one quality that made it psychologically distinctive from almost every other weapon Allied soldiers faced. It offered no recourse. Against infantry fire, you could shoot back. Against tanks, you could maneuver or find cover. Against artillery, you could dig. Even against the MG-42, the German machine gun that fired so fast it sounded like tearing fabric, the weapon Allied infantry called the buzzsaw, there were tactics. Hit the dirt, move to flanking ground, suppress the position. The MG-42 was terrifying, but it was answerable. The 88mm, properly sighted, denied all of those options simultaneously. A tanker couldn't close the range fast enough. An infantryman couldn't dig in fast enough. A bomber crew couldn't alter course after they'd committed to the bomb run. The weapon created situations where training and equipment and courage were simply not enough, and Allied soldiers knew it. They had seen the evidence of what happened to men who ran out of time against it. What added a specific layer of bitterness to the Allied relationship with the 88 was the knowledge that it didn't have to be this way. Britain had developed the 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun, a weapon with penetration capability comparable to the 88 and available in significant numbers. Doctrine forbade using it against ground targets. Field commanders repeatedly requested permission to deploy it as an anti-tank gun. The requests were denied. German batteries with a dozen operational 88s were dismantling British tank regiments, while British batteries with equivalent firepower sat in anti-aircraft positions waiting for aircraft that weren't coming. An observer at the time noted that every time a German 88 was used to kill a British tank, it was one less gun defending German cities. The British made the same choice in reverse and got the worse end of it on the ground. The Germans used their anti-aircraft gun to kill tanks. The British used theirs to defend against air attacks. By late 1941 in North Africa, the gap between those two decisions was measured in hundreds of knocked-out vehicles and the careers of the generals who commanded them. By the time Allied forces reached Normandy in 1944, the institutional memory of the 88 had become its own tactical force. In the Bocage country west of Caen, 88mm guns dug into the thick Norman hedgerows blocked advances week after week following D-Day. A single well-sighted 88 could cover a road or a field approach and make it impassable until the gun was found and destroyed, which meant sending infantry forward to find it and accepting what happened to the men who found it first. Sherman crews who had never been to North Africa or Tunisia had absorbed the lesson through every briefing and every training exercise they'd attended. 88mm positions are the priority threat. Find them before they find you. Because if they find you first, there's nothing left to do. There's a line from a German battery commander's account of fighting on the Western Front in 1944, recalled after the war. He said his battery had been covering a road, and the Americans kept sending tanks down it. Every time a tank appeared, his crew knocked it out. Eventually, they ran out of ammunition, and the Americans didn't run out of tanks. The account is usually quoted as a German admission of defeat, proof that production eventually overcame everything. But read it from the other side of the gun barrel. For every tank that appeared around that corner and got killed, there was a crew inside it who had been told about the 88, had trained to avoid it, and drove forward anyway because the road had to be taken and their turn had come. That calculation, made thousands of times on thousands of roads across Europe, is the other half of what the 88mm cost the Allied army. That's the geometry of the war in miniature. The 88mm gun was arguably the most effective weapon Germany produced in World War II, not because it was the most powerful, but because it worked against everything, in every theater, at distances nothing on the Allied side could match. It forced changes in air strategy, tank doctrine, infantry tactics, and the psychological baseline of an entire army. You could learn to live with the fear of the 88. What you couldn't do was learn to stop being afraid of it. That's the dark reason Allied soldiers hated it. If you want more stories about the weapons that changed not just the tactics, but the psychology of war, subscribe and hit the notification bell. There's more coming.